are moving with our small group this semester of BEM honor students, and our next presenter is Ryan Talbot, who also worked with Professor Jeremy Johnson. And Ryan's title, which I definitely have to look down and read, is called Story, Gameplay, and Theme, Oh My, How I Avoided Ludonarrative Dissonance in Humans Not Found and Designed with Intention. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Ryan, and I'm a senior video game development student, and just a little background for my presentation. Kind of the inspiration for all of this is that I'm getting very interested in narrative design and game writing in games is what I want to move into professionally in the industry. So I went into this project knowing that I wanted to pick a topic related to that would allow me to learn a lot more than I knew already about the topic. And probably one of the biggest buzzwords that you often hear when you talk about ludonarrative design is ludonarrative dissonance. It's a really long set of two words, but if you break it down into core pieces, ludo means game, and narrative is the story, and then dissonance. There's a fundamental disconnect somewhere between the gameplay and the story that just fundamentally clashes and throws you out of the experience. As a brief example, a recent game, The Last of Us 2, you may or may not be familiar with it, but essentially the story is all about two sides of a conflict, how there's good people on both sides, and how you have to approach things with empathy, because if you approach things from a point of aggression, othering the other group, then you immediately break down chances for reconciliation and negotiation. But it's set in a zombie apocalypse where you're fighting with other survivor tribes. So, and the gameplay is, it's fun to run around and shoot your guns and kill people and sneak around and stuff. So it's not a good combination. Neither one really connects with the other in a really important way. And so this has kind of become overused term, but it's still a very useful term to describe a very core fundamental problem that a lot of games need to face. And I also want to clarify just a side note that it's not necessarily a bad thing if you use ludonarrative dissonance intentionally to clash and throw yourself out of the experience. It can actually have a really, if it's used intentionally, it's not necessarily a negative thing. As a quick example, again, there's a lot of games recently that have had more meta-narrative elements where they actively remind you they're a game by having parts of the story where, it's in the actual story of the game that your character can save and rewrite the files of the game. And that then reinforces that it's a game, but it brings the narrative closer to the fundamental core part of the experience modality being a game. And so that would be a way to kind of use the disconnect in a positive way. When I was approaching this problem, I was reminded of a 2019 Game Developers Conference talk that I had seen by Alex Jaffe, and it was called Cursed Problems in Game Design. And through it, he's essentially describing what he's seeing as generally in games that have been brought up, or that you can think about, hypotheticals, where there's core promises you're trying to give to the player about the experience they're going to get from playing your game that just fundamentally clash and cannot coexist together because they're actively opposing each other. And I realized that this sounded to me a lot like ludonarrative dissonance, that it's a very similar idea of core player promises, one gameplay focused and one story focused, that are again clashing. So I sought to use his talk as a framework to help me approach this problem. And in it, he introduces 4 techniques that he presents as ways to solve these problems, because his argument is that these problems, because they conflict at the fundamental level, you cannot ever possibly solve the actual problem. You have to instead subvert and change parts of your promises in order to get them to an easier place where they can be combined. And so in this, at this point, I'd about to come to my prompt for the game that I decided was going to be called Humans Not Found. It was going to be a game where you play as a robot searching for signs of human life in sort of an apocalyptic, desolate area where you have to kind of piece together clues of what might have happened. And so this was just my basic prototype I was working with at the time, just getting your core mechanics and getting physics working and all that fun jazz. And as I was coming back to this talk again and again and thinking about it, he mentioned a specific version where the promise is rooted in between experiences and objectives, so it's experiences from the moment-to-moment gameplay, and then there's a conflict with the objective of the high level, what I want out of the game. Oftentimes he brought this up as an example of objectives would be, I want to win the game, and then maybe in a fighting game, the experiences would be, I want to use a clever combo or show off and do a very flashy move. And so as I was going into this project, I had a kind of preconceived notion that I wanted to write for it. Because being my interest in narrative, being my interest in game writing, I wanted to just practice those skills more. But I kept coming back to my prompt about a desolate landscape devoid of any human life and realized that it would be really hard to make a dialogue system with no other characters in the game. It just did not make sense to me. I tried to wrap my brain around it. I thought maybe if you're looking for clues in this kind of open environment, maybe there can be interaction with the items, where you find an item, where you find a set piece, and maybe there's a short little blurb, maybe it's an internal monologue of the robot, maybe it's just some sort of diagnostic information that you figure out. But then I felt like that too would also feel a little bit off tonally from the idea I was trying to create, because that felt like it would kind of answer too much of the pieces of the mystery that I wanted to kind of breadcrumb the player through, and so that also felt it just didn't feel right for what I was trying to do. Around this time, I was starting to get into player model and animation. It was starting to look marginally more like a game. And I kept on coming back to his core techniques, and I realized that the writing just did not make sense at all. It did not make sense to me how I would fit writing into this game. So I didn't. I didn't put any writing into the game. I used his first technique of barriers. I cut the affordances that weren't going to reinforce the core player promises that I wanted. I figured out the narrative, the tone, and the theme of the game were more important to me than being able to write for it. And so I avoided it that way through his framework. And in the process, I was at the Game Developers Conference this year virtually, and I was at a narrative design roundtable where I was talking with a bunch of industry professionals about narrative problems in games, how they see the current state of narrative in the industry, how do we kind of go forward. And one of the things that was brought up was that there's so often a lack of subtext in games. There's a lot of reasons for this, but essentially, the easiest way I can think to explain it is that because games so often try to appeal to as many players as possible, because obviously they have to make money, they have to be successful, because of this, they wind up appealing to so many different play styles, they kind of have to reach the bare minimum of where a lot of players are at. And I don't think this is a bad thing, but it does mean that if a lot of your players don't even care about the story, they're just playing to have fun, which is fine, and they might even skip the cutscene. You can't hold really key important information in subtext, because not every person, not every player is going to want to look for it, and they're going to feel lost if you try and force them to. And so instead, a lot of times, the way that nuance appears in game narratives is either through character moments or through lore and backstory that for most players, they can brush off and ignore. And for the players who do care about it, they're already going to want to, if you have a favorite character in a game, you're already going to want to really think and look at all the information you can find about them to kind of learn more about them. So this already sort of fits that play style. And then the other piece that they brought up in this kind of discussion we had was that a lot of times games forget about the rule show don't tell. It's for writing, and obviously in writing it works as well in games because the idea is still present that whether it's a game, whether it's a movie, TV show, stage play, there's ways to visually show ideas without explicitly telling them, and those are going to be more nuanced, those are going to be more impactful, those are going to seem more realistic. And the way that this was brought up to me was through animations, environmental design, and level design. If you can see something happen, it feels a lot more stronger, and it hits a lot harder than if you hear about it happening. And so that's sort of where I took this project towards then. I sort of talked with my team, had a lot of sound design talk, I had a lot of going back and forth with 3D models to try and construct a level, an area that would feel like it would fit the purpose and also show the players some of these hints of the tone that I wanted. So I'm sure. Awesome. So then as far as key lessons and takeaways from this project, my first was obviously, I guess, as it kind of has to be in a thesis project with scope creep, my ideas kept getting too big for the amount of time I had. I was initially planning for 3 whole areas with all sorts of different set pieces and all sorts of different hints and ideas. And I just ran out of time, as is inevitable. I had to scope my idea back, cut it smaller, keep only the most essential parts and the most accomplishable parts that I could have had. Next was collaboration. I absolutely could not have gotten this project done without my team to help me. So I have to shout them out. Bailey, my producer, was so helpful to keep me organized and on track, make sure we were having frequent meetings with our whole team, figuring out where everyone was at level-wise, with where they were accomplishing, making sure we were crossing off our tasks in the Jira board so that everyone could look at it and keep track of what was happening. And then Cindy, my 3D modeler, and Jake, my sound designer, they were so helpful to me because 3D modeling and sound design are not strong suits I have. I like them, but I'm personally not very good at them. And they just knocked it out of the park, and they were also so helpful to me, not only with quick delivery of these assets, but also they were so gracious in taking on this extra burden that was not for a class, just to help me. And then go through revision processes when I saw that maybe we could do something slightly different, and they were very responsive to feedback, and so that was incredible help as well. In general, this was a helpful framework to accomplish what I set out to do, which was to kind of create and then solve this example of Ludonarrative dissonance. I think if I had more time and I wanted to try this again, I would try and arrive at a harder problem to resolve. I was expecting initially that I would have to still include both core promises in some way in the game. And because I cut it out, I want to try and see next time if this also works in some of his other methods where you have to let them coexist, but then prevent sort of either swapping between the two or making one more enhanced, but I still have both there. I think that would be an interesting future research. And then also the final and most important thing I think I learned is that there's so much about game dev, both in the narrative side, but also in general, that you can just constantly learn. It's something you can never know everything about, and that really excites me. I love learning, and so this, even though this is like my final capstone thesis presentation, it doesn't feel like the end of like my game dev education. It definitely feels like the beginning, and I'm very excited to see where it goes next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Stay up there for questions. Questions for Ryan?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was listening to your presentation and I was watching the demo that you did, showcasing the open world concept that you have, and I really love that. I'm curious on your thoughts on one of the really popular games right now, Elden Ring, an incredibly immense world, open for exploration that has a narrative, but most players don't quite understand that they're creating it as it goes along. In fact, it often gets lost in some of the action aspects of the game. Do you think that there's a desire for more games like this that are truly open world and lacking a little bit of narrative, something that you need to create yourself, rather than something that's sort of prescribed and followed along, like a Persona 5?
I think it's really difficult because, again, he mentions curse problems, and he gives several examples out, Jaffe does in his talk. And I think one that he kind of didn't mention, but I feel like we've actually had discussions about it in class, is that everyone wants the idea of an open sandbox game where every decision that you make matters and everything has some sort of consequence that you can then kind of create this narrative. But then the problem with that is that A, that's so much work to get done, that's an insane amount of work, but also if anything can happen, it's really hard to structure what has significance. And so they have to, the player in that case has to be very intentional about bringing their own goals to create something present, whereas in most other game narratives, a lot is already sort of prescribed or kind of set in stone in order to kind of help encourage that so that the player feels less lost in sort of trying to forge a narrative.
Yeah. What about the world building? You just kind of like learn through exploring what you create versus when did your devs start filling in the details for the rest of the world?
I think a lot of it was tools dependent, honestly. I had kind of this idea of like this desolate landscape, and then my next thought was like, that's great. I don't know how to do that, and so let's see if I can find a great picture of it. Kind of all this texturing and the path in the background, the hills, the mountains. I was able to find essentially a not yet approved plugin for Unity, but I had to kind of do a workaround to get convince Unity that it wasn't malware and that it would accept it. Then I had to download that and kind of just do this learning process for this kind of experimental tool to kind of mold and shape the landscape and paint it. And then that was where a lot of the creativeness came from, was kind of limited by my technical restraints and my time restraints of needing to either use art assets for my artists or to instead find them free versions online. And if I couldn't find a good version, I didn't have time to make one myself. I only had so much time for my artists to make assets. So it was, I think, a lot of the world building, and both physical and also just like narrative world building sense, came a lot through the technical constraints and the time constraints.
Yeah.
Yes.
Me and but I was thinking it was interesting. We talked in class and stuff about the lack of subtext in narratives, and that being a cheap reason why many use systems that are conversations or just really boring conversations. But your talk got me thinking about one thing that I wonder if you have any thoughts on subtext in terms of narrative and environmental design, right? So you have, so many games have also no subtext, where they just really paint a sign that says what they mean. And it seems like your project is creeping up closer on not really saying, on the face of it, what the.
Yeah, I wanted to be, that was definitely a focus in my, in like the kind of assets that I was looking for, and kind of this sort of like mini vignette type things I was trying to design in there. I was almost worried that I went too far with like multiple piles of bones and stuff, and there's only so much I could think of. And again, also environmental and level design is not generally my forte, so that was also a big learning curve for me. But yeah, I do think that that's where this is headed, and where I hope games can, at least not all games obviously, but some games I feel will be greatly benefited by a more nuanced approach to how they build their worlds visually, yeah.
Right, have you taken theater classes?
A little bit.
Okay, I got so much, as I said, I'm not a video game person. It's really fascinating, and I was thinking so much about theater for a lot of, and it seems like a lot of theater artists and theorists are thinking, I think, about similar questions to you, sort of, what awareness do the audience to have, taking them out of the narrative, what is the space, what is the audience's role in interacting with the narrative. So it's just, it struck me that seemed like a set of discourses that you were familiar with.
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, it is now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Johnson up to give you your story, award. Congratulations, and he'll also be able to say a few words about working with you.
All right, back again. But yeah, no, Ryan has been a wonderful student. I think he's very thoughtful. I know he's going to go far in the industry. He's already, he's one of those students you say, you should go to this thing. You should go to this industry networking event. You'll meet people. And then he's there at the industry networking events, meeting people. I think, I don't know if he ends up being a natural leader, whether or not he intends to be. He tends to find his way to a project like this one, where a bunch of people are jump on board with him and follow his lead through the desert.
Do a bunch of
yeah. And so I think that is it's impressive, and I think it's not a skill that a lot of game developers naturally have. So yeah, it's been a pleasure to work with you. Thank you for asking me, Steve.
Thank you.